Cool. So today we're going to be doing a demo of Trixta IDE 2.0, and Barry's going to do the demo. But just before we do, I'm going to just give you some background, some history, and a little bit of the business rationale of doing this. So, as I think almost all of you know, most of you know, that Trixta is a development platform that lets us build distributed applications. I'm not going to go into incredible detail about this because it gets very complicated very quickly, but I'm going to just talk about a few things. So when we started the company, we built the IDE at a certain point. We built our very first IDE. It was actually it was a 0.1 version. And what we did was we actually built a basic abstraction on top of software development, which I'll tell you very briefly about after this. And what we did was we realized that using a visual metaphor, we could actually describe like various aspects of the software. And then over time, we built a library, we built the very first visualization, we built our first proper IDE. And that allowed us to visually describe large pieces of the software. And by doing that, we didn't have to write a lot of the code to do that. And it also automated a lot of the DevOps. So our goals early on were to look at the concept of effectively microservices. People use services in software, in distributed software development as a way to make it easier to chunk down your software into smaller pieces. And in Trixta, we have a microservice concept called spaces. It's slightly different to microservices because it's self-managed, it's easy to work with. You can have a lot more of them if you want to. And in these examples today, and probably for the next while, we're just going to show you a single space, which is a microservice. Inside the microservice, we have a concept called, we have activity, which is described as actions. Sorry, what was that? We have a concept of activity, and the activity is described as actions or reactions. So an action is where you're effectively sending a message to the server, and the reaction is when a server sends a message to some system. And what we do is, from a security perspective, from a roles-based security perspective, we allow certain roles to be described, and then those roles may have the right to make an action or to receive a reaction. And it's not just a roles-based security measure, it's actually a way of actually describing our systems in a way that's understandable. And it's kind of meshed into one thing where you're actually describing your system in terms of the kind of roles that would probably be in a system, but that also takes care of the security layer, of the roles-based security layer around that. Every action and reaction is effectively managed by a process, and that's actually the code effectively. But in Trixta, we describe that in the form of a visual flow system, which we will show you today. And in the first IDE, we had a more complex arrangement, and we've simplified that a lot now. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how that works, but I'm sure Barry's going to be talking about that. So when we built the first IDE, we spent a lot of time and resources, building out the visual layer around that, and throwing a lot of JavaScript and React at building out the IDE. And effectively, we reinvented the wheel and built our own IDE. But in hindsight, looking back now, that isn't the best use of our time, because we have so much to do as a small team. We just can't be doing that. So what we did to build up the second IDE is to use a framework called Project Thea, which is a fork of VS Code, and that allows us to have a web-based system that can run anywhere. And it's got various people working on that project. It manages all kinds of languages, and it allows all kinds of ways of building an IDE. And by doing that and building out IDE 2.0, we actually reduce the footprint of code that we have to manage ourselves. We also went one step further, and that is we even reduced the way that people build project applications by removing a lot of the JavaScript needs, by actually using Trixta internally. And I won't explain that. I'm sure Barry will go into that. But effectively, today we're showing off our first, stab at getting a usable IDE 2.0. It's still early. Every week going forward, we're going to be doing a demo. Feel free to join if you want to, every single week. But each week we'll be showing you some of the advancements that we have made in the previous week. So Dev, who's in the meeting, is almost full-time focused on IDE. He's kind of driving it forward. And then Barry is the brains behind the whole thing as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Barry to start his demo.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Mark pretty much covered most of those points. The most important thing with moving over to this was to sort of spread the load and take it out of our team and let us focus on, the core of Trixta and not so much on building an IDE. So let me share my screen and show you instead of telling you. All right, so anyone who's familiar with the previous IDE, you'll notice a couple of things that are similar, but you'll also notice a lot that is quite different. And the first thing that should strike you is just how everything feels kind of uniform and as though it has been through a process of design and UX, and that is because it has. We based this on the fork of VS Code, so we aren't trying to sort of reinvent the way that people program as such, in that we're trying to use the best practices and improve on them and make that available to non-technical people as well. So you've got three sort of main areas. Let me move this stuff around. So you've got your left-hand panel, your right-hand panel, and you can get extra ones at the bottom. And this is quite easy. We can pretty much just create a rack component and sort of put it on screen wherever. So we successfully got these, that kind of part of the development outsourced essentially to the open source community. But like Mark was also saying, instead of using Thea to sort of handle all the communication between these panels, we actually go via Trixta. And that's a good thing as well in terms of going forward, is that we would like, because currently this requires a server, because it's a node-based application. You can run it as an Electron app, which is great, but I would like to go back to a fully client-side running application. So it's quite good to sort of steer clear of anything that is too tightly integrated with Thea. So it's a very light touch. We're pretty much just here for the layouts and the styles and the look and feel, and everything else is Trixta. I'm going to sort of, okay, so the idea really in Trixta is to configure the system. We want to build a system that is always running, right? So from the beginning, it's always running. It's almost like a sculptor would have what they want is in the stone. It's already there. They just kind of need to shape or remove what they want for it to sort of be exposed. So same sort of thing applies here. And really what that means is being able to sort of shape what's there and to just edit the parts of it. So we've got the main navigation on the left, which is to sort of take your biggest kind of fast navigation, your course navigation, to quickly get you to a context that you can view. And that context view is in the center. So if I click on, so this is all underneath a space. So in future, we would expect to also be able to move between different spaces in the IDE. If I click on the roles item in the top here, we get a view which shows all the roles in the space. And any of these nodes, I can click on it. It will sort of show me that item in the context that makes most sense for it. In this case, I've clicked on a role and we can see the actions and reactions that apply to that role all on one screen. Now, over time, I'd like to see, ideas or hear ideas from the community to see, okay, well, what would be more useful or less useful on these various screens, and for people to be able to also contribute sort of unique views that would be useful, because we really about whatever is fastest and most useful. you can similarly look at all the actions, a particular action, and a flow that's connected to that action. Now, you might imagine one of the things that we weren't able to do before is go to a reaction and, although we haven't done it yet, to be able to see which flows are connected to that reaction, which flows are sort of associated with this reaction. And you can kind of, when you are investigating as you're developing, it's much easier for you to move around to the piece of the system that you're familiar with and then get orientated quickly. So yeah, this left-hand panel is really just to quickly get you to the main context. And then the center view is to sort of really start to orientate yourself and get visibility, potentially get debug information. And the code in Trixta is all made up of, we still want to, all the patterns that programmers have used up to this point are good, and a lot of them shouldn't be reinvented. So these you can think of as functions, each of these steps. And every function that you have an opportunity to create a unique user interface for it. So when you build a step in Trixta, you can create a schema which defines the shape of the input for this particular step, which is like a function. And out of the gate, this IDE should generate a user interface for you. And I hope to bring in a concept of presets so that you can browse a couple of ones that the step author or your company has already created, which you can sort of apply to that step, and then also see what those effects are on the fly. That's a really important aspect of this entire project, is to get to a point where you can sort of play around with the system and see immediately what it is that you get out of changing some sort of configuration. Because like I said before, the system should always be working. That's at least what we aim for. You can then just see what changes you would make to the system. So if you wanted to, any one of these settings, we also want to be able to offer the ability to add a custom control to it. So in some cases, where the system might be looking for just the setting, like a name of the setting, you might want to use something that can go into a little bit more of a more complex sort of wizard potentially, or select something on the canvas, like maybe you want to refer to something else on the canvas. Anything it's really up to you. What would make this easier for a user to understand? And I would also like to have like training for you to be able to train yourself. So any step and any setting in a step, to be able to have buttons nearby, which could take you to the actual information about it, a video about how it works or what it is, and potentially even get you into contact with the author itself if it really comes to that. Let me just see, what else can I show you? So in terms of progress, we can run this, we can run these flows, but it's pretty much where we're at the moment. We can add and remove all of these kind of major items in the space through this interface. We can create and delete. You can select them. You can see there's some styling work still to be done. One of the big things that is a big change for us that's going to help a lot is that instead of when we change a step in this flow, before we would have to save the entire flow again. And now we are moving away from that and instead to work with just individual steps. So if a user had to update this step, it would just update this step. The IDE would get a new version of that step, and I'll talk about how they would broadcast to people and collaborating. And the end result is a much faster and sort of streamlined workflow. So you're not getting flows that are sort of reloading all the time. Our current IDE has that problem, and you lose sort of track of where you were working. in terms of the collaboration, so because this is working through Trixta, like I said, if I click on something, this actually sends through an action to Trixta and it shows the screen because it receives a reaction from Trixta. That same reaction can be listened to by other users. So you can essentially collaborate, and anyone else can follow through with their IDE and actually follow somebody else working, or potentially have more than one person working on the same flow at the same time. You can even do one of these features you see in other applications where you could potentially track the cursor of another user just to get orientated and, you know, point out where it is that you'd like the person to focus on and, you know, get their attention. What else? So yeah, I'd like to just open up to some questions for anything that you guys are seeing on screen right now that you'd like to ask about. Yeah, you know, because we're in this sort of VS Code fork, there's a lot of things in this IDE that prompt us to do things that we would always want to do, like shortcut keyboards, quick commands that you can type in and get to different places in the application. We've got sort of output kind of terminals if we need them, that sort of thing. Yeah, just generally looks great, which I think is going to be very important for people to sort of adopt this and to build a community, because I think that in this day and age, you know, it's got to be good, and it's got to be quick and useful and enjoyable.
Cool. So I'm gonna prompt again for questions. Oh, is that Sean?
Yeah, I have two, if you don't mind, Mark.
Yeah, go for it.
Barry, if you could just take us through the right panel, the circle and so on that side. I'm not too sure if you went through that. And second, have you kind of you know, sort of not really timed, but have you got an X percentage on how much faster you guys are able to build out flows on this version of the IDE versus the previous version? Are you seeing like, what kind of speed increase are you seeing overall?
So we haven't started timing us. Like I would do that as soon as we can, yeah. Because we haven't got our updates. We don't update steps yet. So that's something that Dev is actually working on today. So once we can do that, then I'll have a better answer for you. But you look, at the very least, this IDE, you're not changing screens between our previous one. You would have to sort of move away and change context. So the idea is to not to keep yourself well orientated the entire time. And I would think that, yeah, I mean, I think the one other thing is that we have no quirks, because the current IDE has quite a lot of quirks that prevents your average user from using it. So the internal team can sort of attest to that, where, you know, you kind of need to play around with it for a bit, and it needs to be, you know, if you have a control that you've designed to do something and it doesn't work, you know, that's just, it's not ready for general use. So that's our main focus, is to get it into a place where it's intuitive for everyone and it works for everyone. And then we'll focus on just roots, like baseline speed, getting everything faster, shortcut keys, you know, that sort of thing.
I'm going to ask a question. Yeah. And that is, I mean, the way that we built this IDE, we're using Trixta on the inside, even between panels. So like the client side actually, routes through Trixta. So in some cases, you're actually routing through a server. So how could it be that routing through a server that's external and maybe isn't local could be faster than actually speaking to JavaScript locally?
Well, I would say, you know, it wouldn't necessarily be faster. I think we would be able to make it even faster if you reference local data, and in some cases we are. So when you make an update to a step, that step gets broadcasted out to the clients, gets put in a sort of the reducer, sort of the store on the client side, and the client then can refer to that. But the development in terms of, being able to sort of unlock that entire process is much, much faster. So we can say, all right, well, we know that Trixta can do a lot of these things that are potentially complicated to do on the front end or integrate with other systems. Let's just use that instead. And this same sort of, because what we're doing a lot in is just reinvesting in the same sort of ideas. So this navigation on the left-hand side, for example, was built before we built the middle panel. And we aren't too happy with the performance of this. So what we're thinking of doing is actually using the same technology that runs this, style it different, and use that in the left-hand side. And because we sort of continue to use the same code, we can then sort of optimize it further and further. And part of that optimization would also potentially say, okay, well, let's reference data from client side if it's available. If it's not, we can lazy load it, that sort of thing, and start to optimize in that way. But continue to use the general sort of approach of working through, or having the server or the business, I should say, orchestrate the entire process. So that's kind of where you want to be able to design the system. So saying, in this case, the role itself is down here, the Trixta IDE user. That's the one that we connect to. And the reactions, if I show you here, a lot of them are display certain views and sync data. So as an IDE user, this is my responsibility, is to do these things when I'm asked to do it. And that's the way we think in terms of the system.
Okay, any other questions from anyone? Come on, I'm sure you must have questions. Anything?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
It looks really good, I must say. Like the current web app, everybody, I guess, can agree that it can be a little bit sometimes confusing. But the one thing which, I don't know if it's an IDE question or just a general Trixta question, but it's more around, the saying with great power comes great responsibility. And what I find is in Trixta, sometimes it's too easy to break things accidentally by playing around. So I guess this makes it even easier, because now you have an app that's just like running on your computer, and you don't actually know that you're changing server code. So is there like some ideas around, versioning steps or versioning flows, so that you can test a specific flow, and then say, okay, this flow is working. I want to make it now live on the server, or you know what I mean? Like almost like a way to run flows while you're testing them separately.
Yeah. So we already have the concept of versioning flows. And like I said earlier, I actually want to move that even to the concept of versioning steps. And so we have that. So you can push that to Git and pull it again. And that's how we actually have been doing a lot of the work with you.
Yeah.
And
I just want to point out that Michael's one of the founders of Waitroom, and so he's used to working with Trixta on some level.
We're using it a lot. Yeah.
So we're still sort of learning through working with you and other people in terms of how it works, because we've got a lot of options. One of the options is each individual flow can belong or can be connected to a different repo completely. Although in your case, we've only really needed to connect to one repo. So, it seems a bit awkward. Like, why would you set each flow to have its own one? We could just use the same one. So we've realized, okay, you probably want a default, and then you want to be able to override that in cases where maybe you want to source something from another person or client or project or team. But I've also found that in your case, what we've done is we've developed on a development server and then taken that entire configuration and moved that up the stages. So we don't really change things on our staging or product or production environment. In fact, I would go as far as removing roles on those environments completely so that you wouldn't actually be able to do any of the updating or whatever that you would otherwise expect to. However, we've left them in your case, because we did find that sometimes it is useful. When we did some sort of emergency fixes the other day, that was useful, that tooling was still so then it really comes down to permissions. Who has permission to do that? And making sure that those roles make sense on different environments that you have in your business.
Yeah, I mean, one example that I really like is the way Retool does it with their versioning. Maybe have a look at that, how you're able to create versions and then you can make versions public. It's just like they already manage the dev and production environments, and then you can switch between the two, and you can also roll back versions. There's this kind of app wide rather than maybe like in your case, it's a lot more granular, but I like the idea of being able to test the specific version and know that it's working, and then saying, okay, let's bank this one,
Absolutely. In some cases, we've had so even in a dev environment, when there's a lot of people working on it, you don't, ideally you don't want to break anything. So what we've done sometimes is inlining flows. We almost, you kind of branch a piece of logic out, which wouldn't normally be executed by anything that's currently running. And you can just sort of test that stuff at the same time. Or the other option is to create an entire new flow in parallel to it and run that, and then just sort of deprecate the old one so you could duplicate it. So we're learning, and there's a couple of other things I'd also like to do in terms of running a flow. So let's say I'm trying to debug something now, I get an incoming payload. I want to be able to sort of make changes and repeat sections of the flow. And that's possible because of the way it works. So I could sort of, take a breakpoint and say, okay, I want this code to sort of run up to this step and then restart over here and just keep going at like a certain pace. And then I can tweak and I can pause it and I can resume it and I can change the payloads and I can resume it. Because I find that developers lose a lot of time trying to sort of get back to that sort of state that they had previously. And because this is a functional system, we don't really working with state. If you are changing data in a database, then I want to be able to bypass those steps somehow so that you kind of just turn it off or you mute it for while you're working, that sort of idea. And it's quite important for me to also, when building these steps, to be able to classify them as pure or not. So whether they have side effects or not, and be able to easily show someone, oh, it's safe to run this code because they're all pure functions. You're not going to have any sort of impact on any data, for example. But if there is data, for the system to be able to warn you and maybe help you prevent those things from happening if you want to just kind of like continue the code and iterate in that way.
We still have about 5 minutes or so left. So if anybody wants to ask anything else.
I think another thing I'd like to talk about, which is probably not that obvious, is that some of these steps can work in tandem with each other. So we've got a few examples of steps that there's sort of like one which contains other ones and they work. So I'm very curious to see how some step authors might create functions that will work in that way. And yeah, I'm excited to see how people can look at patterns that are forming in development and see how they can like reuse it. So it's very much similar to development that we're used to. It's just like, okay, well, if there is a pattern that is working well in your development, can you package it in a way that has that you can deliver to the rest of the system, that can be plugged in and has an easy to use interface, which you can assist someone along that journey of filling in the settings and maybe giving them examples and that sort of thing. Because what we used to is you go out, you find a library, right? You find something that's useful in your code base. You got to write the code. The reference documentation is in another place, and you pretty much, you got to read it there and like you translate it. And it's a process of sort of figuring those things out. Like we here just trying to bring those things closer together. So the place that you play around with the code and learn about the code is the same place you actually write the code and commit the code and share with everyone else. And just trying to bring all those things closer together and shorten the distance between picking up something new and actually getting it to work and implementing it.
I just want to mention one thing that probably is not at all obvious to people who don't know much about Trixta. And that is, as you're creating spaces and as you're creating roles and actions and reactions, and as you're building out the steps in your flows, what's really happening under the hood is that you're building Elixir code. And you're able to put that code into Git, and then next time you come there, it reads it from Git and it reestablishes itself. So it's not obvious, but somebody who was an Elixir developer could purely look at the code if they wanted to. But that's what the IDE is doing under the hood. In the steps, you may be coding them maybe in different ways, and you aren't generating the whole thing, you're generating the flows. But ultimately it manages all of that. It also manages like DevOps. So it spins up your infrastructure for you, and we're going to be adding a lot more to that over the rest of this year, where you can actually spin up lighter versions of, say, Kubernetes to manage, your systems. And over time, we're going to be adding more types of DevOps where you can actually run on, Web3 types of architectures and systems, like the internet computer and that type of thing. And Trixta is built as a decentralized system, which means that it can run, anything that's decentralized in architecture could actually run centralized ways if you want to, but you can also run totally on Web3 if you wanted to. So I just wanted to, we are running out of time. So I just wanted to say that, this is the very, very first, demo of what we have. And it may not seem like much yet because we haven't showed you a lot of functional stuff yet. But our goal every week is to advance it, and we'll probably do certain themes each. So we won't like work through everything we spoke about the previous week. We're going to probably show you themes of things we've worked on in that week. And we'll probably distribute other information during the week. So if you have questions, feel free to email us. We're happy to talk about it next week. We'd love you to watch us on our journey. We are videoing this, and we are going to be putting this onto YouTube, most likely. So that's my closing comments. Barry, anything else from your side?
No, that pretty much sums it up. I'm excited. I think we're just trying to hit sort of parity with the old IDE first, and then once we're there, we'll be able to continue forward from where we left off with it. I just felt we needed a better base for us to work with, so that the team didn't have to worry so much about a lot of the stuff that the rest of the open source community is already on.
So it's really nice not having to worry about all those menu structures and all of that, and looking a bit into Thea and the sort of things it exposes along with the terminal, things like our Python steps. There's a possibility there to actually have the Thea IDE handle all the Python code, like auto completion and function generation and all of that sort of stuff. So when it comes to, and that obviously gets compiled underneath the flow and everything. So that's literally generating real code with the proper IDE on the system that you're running the code with. So quite impressive, yeah.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, Dave. And Barry, I'll give you the last word. We have a minute left. Otherwise, we can take a bye until next week.
That's it. Thanks for joining, guys. I'm looking forward to also taking all your feedback as we go along. get to a stage where we can actually start to honestly talk about what is working and what isn't working, and make it better and better, and yeah, get creative, like build some software, working software quickly.
Great. Thanks, Barry, and thanks everybody. Hopefully we'll see all of you and more next week.
Thanks, guys.
Take
Hi,
care.
everybody.
Ciao.